Hey everyone, it is Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. This week we're looking at the most flavorful cards in Shadows over Innistrad block. Obviously, the idea of flavor is fairly subjective, but for me, the essence of flavor is how well the effect of a card reflects what the card is supposed to represent, and how well it represents certain story elements or calls back certain cards from the past. Unique and interesting designs also get bonus points. I think it is no secret that Shadows over Innistrad block is probably the most flavorful block of all time. Let me know if you disagree in the comments, but I have a hard time imagining a more flavorful block. In fact, when Shadows over Innistrad was just getting spoiled several months ago, I did an MTG Top 10 featuring what I thought were the 10 most flavorful Magic cards in all of Magic's history, because I was already so inspired by how flavorful the set was looking. The block in the end definitely didn't disappoint, so let's go ahead and get started with the 10th card on our list. At number 10, I have Garance Masterpiece. The card itself is a very cool design, but the card only gets a lot of flavor points once you put it next to a card from the old Innistrad block, and that is Griselbrand. It's kind of a subtle thing, but Garance Masterpiece seems to be Geralf's attempt at stitching together, from the dead parts of various creatures, the way Geralf does as a stitcher, into a being that's supposed to be sort of like Griselbrand. If you really look at the art side by side, this becomes the most apparent, but there's also little things going on the cards itself. Both are 7/7 flyers. Both care about, cards in your hand to a certain extent. Griselbrand draws you cards, of course. Obviously, Geralf's efforts didn't quite hit the mark, and Garance Masterpiece gets weaker the more cards you have in your hand, but this is definitely a neat and subtle way of referring back to one of the most famous cards from the original Innistrad block. All right, let's go ahead and move on to number 9. Here I have Thing in the Ice, Awoken Horror. I will say that flip cards in general have some advantage in a video discussing flavorfulness, at least as I think of flavorfulness, because it allows for extra design space that can better reflect what a card is supposed to represent in a way that other cards really can't. So expect to see a few more flip cards on this list. Thing in the Ice is one of these. First and most simply, a block of ice being a 0/4 with Defender makes a lot of sense, but that's some pretty basic flavor, the kind of thing you see on cards all the time. After that, though, the fact that the card has ice counters on it and transforms after a certain amount of magic, that is, instant sorcery spells, have been performed is super flavorful too. Ice melts naturally, and that's what this, the removal of ice counters is supposed to represent. And the idea that magic would help disturb the creature inside of the block of ice to break out of the block of ice makes a lot of sense. Once it transforms, it is naturally a massive kraken. That is, a 7/8 makes sense, but it has a little bit more flavor once it transforms as well, and that it doesn't bounce other horrors. So that's kind of a cool effect that, there's not another tribal horror effect out there. So that's what I have at number 9. At number 8, I have Triskaidekaphobia. I know that when I was a kid playing a lot of Magic, Magic definitely helped me learn a lot of words, and I'm sure a lot of people, both adult and children, learned the word Triskaidekaphobia as a result of this card. This card is super unique, and it is one of only a few cards in Magic that can instantly win you the game if you fulfill a certain requirement, and those kind of cards are usually fairly flavorful. 13 is a number that shows up a lot on the plane of Innistrad, and Triskaidekaphobia is definitely the 13th of all the cards that mention the number 13. Triskaidekaphobia is the fear of the number 13, and this card does a great job of reflecting that in ways both obvious and more subtle. The number 13 appears on the card multiple times in the text box, and the number 13 is something this card makes you want to avoid, so you should fear it, basically, and it makes your opponent want to avoid it as well, giving them fear. This is because any player who has 13 life at the upkeep of the player who controls Triskaidekaphobia instantly loses the game. It's a card that completely warps the game of Magic, changing how both you and your opponent play, and that's pretty cool, especially when the card also happens to be flavorful. But on top of the more obvious references to 13, the art also references the number a ton. There are 13 items hanging from the roof in the left part of the art there. 13 drops of blood, 13 logs in the fireplace. There's even 13 rivets visible on the barrel. It also depicts a man running away from the cabin or room where this strange occurrence of the number 13 has occurred. And if that's not a great representation of Triskaidekaphobia in art, I don't know what is. And it's also the effect of the card is very good, a very good representation of the idea of Triskaidekaphobia. So at number 7, I have Coax from the Blind Eternities. This card is meant to represent a pivotal moment in the storyline, and that is the moment in which Nahiri's efforts have seemed to have paid off, and Emrakul is being drawn to the plane of Innistrad. I will go on record saying that I hate that we had 2 blocks that had Eldrazi in it in a row, but I also go on record by saying that this card is a really great representation of that important story moment. Emrakul is a being who exists in the blind eternities, which is the space between planes. This card represents that by allowing you to grab an Eldrazi from anywhere you want to grab it from. Doesn't even have to be your sideboard or anything like that, at least if you're playing not in a sanctioned event. In a sanctioned event, it does have to be your sideboard, which makes it a little less flavorful, but still some flavor there. Your sideboard is, sort of another... It's usually a place you can't go in Magic, sort of like the Blind Eternities are, although there have been Wish cards in the past, but this is the first one in a really long time. So it's a very flavorful way of representing Nahiri's summoning of Emrakul. So why the card's blue, I'm not exactly sure, especially because Nahiri's red-white, so that's a little bit of a flavor fail maybe, but regardless, it's a very flavorful card for the most part. At number 6, I have Elusive Tormentor / Insidious Mist. I promised more flip cards, and here is one of them. This is actually a card that got spoiled fairly early on in Shadows over Innistrad, and it is a card that got me excited for all the flavor in the set, that really made me think about all the great flavor that had already been spoiled. And it's still, I think, one of the most flavorful cards in the block. It's a perfect marriage between what the card is meant to represent and what the card does. The card references the fact that in many types of literature, movies, video games, anything featuring vampires are capable of transforming. Sometimes it is into a bat, which is something they knocked out in the original Innistrad block, but other times they are described as having the ability to transform their body into mist, allowing them into any room. Elusive Tormentor represents that. On the Elusive Tormentor side, you see a vampire observing that there is a person inside a house, and the Tormentor is obviously interested in feeding on that person. Unlike most cards that transform, Elusive Tormentor Insidious Mist can control when it transforms on both sides. So when it needs to, it can transform and get in for unblockable damage, or, in terms of the flavor of the card, get into the room and attack and kill the man inside the room, who you can see holding, the bottle as the mist begins coming into the room. You can also transform it to make a removal not work on it, which is also very flavorful. Mists, being hexproof and indestructible makes a lot of sense. So when it needs to, you can transform it. And again, the fact that it can transform on both sides is a pretty unique effect. I mean, lots of cards transform on both sides, but you can't control when it happens. And this is a card that allows that. At number 5, I have Startled Awake, Persistent Nightmare, another flip card, but this one's pretty unique because it isn't a permanent on the front, something no other flip card can say. The flavor in this card is obviously amazing. One side of it mills the opponent for the flavorful Shadows over Innistrad, Innistrad block in general, number of 13 when it is a sorcery, and then it can come back from the graveyard as its transformed self, a 1/1 Nightmare with Skulk. Obviously, the creature type is very flavorful. It's not one we see a lot of these days, but it works out great there. And the name of the cards themselves and what they represent is also very flavorful. The idea of being startled awake and the creature side being a persistent nightmare is meant to feel like an endless cycle of recurring nightmares that just keep you from sleeping well. And the way that's represented is by being milled constantly. And that's usually a way that insanity or psychological problems are represented in Magic, and it's a way that makes a lot of sense. And definitely, especially when you're up against this in Limited, it really is a nightmare to have your opponent play this against you. It's a little less powerful, obviously, and constructed when you have a 60-card deck, but still, I think the card does a great job of representing the terrible, terrible feeling of having recurring nightmares. So that's what I have at number 5. Next, I have Soul Separator. This card is really cool. It does something very unique, which makes the card fun to play with to begin with, but it also happens to do something incredibly flavorful. And it's a great example of the name and art of a card being perfectly reflected in its effect. In the art, we see a human having his soul forcibly removed or separated from him. This card does exactly that. It lets you take any creature from your graveyard and gives you 2 creature tokens. One of them is a 1/1 spirit, who is a copy of the card in every way except for power and toughness, meant to represent the soul of the creature. And the other is a zombie who has nothing except the power and toughness of the card, the corpse of the creature, the soulless body of the creature. So there's a lot of flavor here. I never really thought about, the power and toughness of a creature representing just its physical form, and then the text of a card representing its soul. But this card, that's exactly what you would, in terms of Magic, that's exactly what you would think of as soul versus body. And I think that's a really cool way to represent that in the card. And it's also a card that seems like it would be a lot of fun to play with. All right, so next I have Skin Invasion, Skin Shredder. The only non-rare to make this list, for the most part. You'll see that there's a little bit of an exception to that, but this card is really interesting. On one side is an aura that gives a creature the frenzy effect, that is, that they have to attack every turn if able. This itself is already pretty flavorful. The idea being that the skin parasite in the aura in the aura, that the aura represents rather, is driving the creature it is attached to insane, meaning it has no control over itself. But it goes further than that, of course. If the creature that Skin Invasion is attached to dies, the player who controlled the aura gets Skin Shredder. The creature that was driving its host insane leaps forth from the dead creature's body once it dies, having, used its host as long as it had to so that it could transform into Skin Shredder. It's very cool and worth noting that it is also a nod to body horror type movies. Shadows over Innistrad Block and Innistrad Block 2 in general try to pay homage to just about every horror trope there is, and this covers another one. So at number 2, I kind of cheated. I included 2 cards. I have Gisela the Broken Blade and Bruna the Fading Light. These are cards that are flavorful in part because of the history they already had. They're angels who appeared in Innistrad Block originally, and their appearance here shows the Emrakul's continued influence on this realm. We already know that Avacyn went crazy and had to be killed by Sorin, and these angels are also being influenced by Emrakul, even to a greater degree, actually, now that Emrakul has arrived. They have taken on the horror creature type, and they can actually meld together into an Eldrazi angel, not a creature type I ever really thought I would see. I will admit that when I saw that Meld was going to be an Eldritch Moon, I thought it seemed a little bit too Yu-Gi-Oh!, but I think they did a good job here, even if they did go a little Dragon Ball Z with the name of the melded creature. The melded Brazella actually has the exact combined power and toughness of these 2 creatures, as well as the 4 keywords that appear between the 2 of them. And that's kind of a cool little subtle flavor thing. On top of that, Bruna can help assemble the 2 creatures in play because she can bring Gisela back from the graveyard. I think they just did a great job in the art and design of these creatures and kept everything very flavorful, and I think they deserve credit for that. So at number 1, I kind of cheated again, actually including 2 cards, and this is where you see that there's actually another uncommon on the list in a way. But these cards are connected. You already know from my inclusion of Garance Masterpiece on this list that I really like cards that do a good job of referencing older cards from the same plane, and this is a perfect example. This card doesn't just reference a card from the original Innistrad block. It is the continued story of one of the most popular creatures from the original Innistrad block, and perhaps one of the most popular of all time, and maybe most hated by some as well, and that is Delbert of Secrets. Delbert of Secrets is already a pretty flavorful card, a 1/1 wizard who was looking for some sort of secret in the insects he held captive, which eventually led to his experiments on himself and his transformation into the insectile aberration. And these 2 cards, Aberrant Researcher and Docent of Perfection, are the continued story of this same Delver of Secrets, which is what he was at first. And we see a lot of super flavorful things going on here. We pick up where the aberration left off with the Aberrant Researcher. It's actually the exact same size. It's a 3/2 flyer. It does cost more, obviously. It would have to. But it indicates that the research isn't over yet. In the flavor text, it says metamorphosis is a process. So he knows there's more transformations that he can undergo. He's digging being an insectile aberration and wants to take things even further. And again, he transforms, thanks to instant and sorcery cards, into perfected form, who has completely lost his human creature type altogether and taken on the horror creature type. It's just an insect horror now. But it doesn't just end there. That's what we had in Shadows over Innistrad. But in Eldritch Moon, they gave us Docent of Perfection. Now, things in the art here get really interesting because, again, he's no longer human at all. And if you go back and look at Delver of Secrets, the Delver has all of these insects he's holding captive. But by the time he's become the Docent of Perfection, he's actually holding humans captive and continuing to do experiments on these humans and on himself. That's represented by the fact that instants and sorcery spells make human wizards. That's sort of the prisoner wizard that is there. But it also can transform, and it becomes an Eldrazi insect. Whether this means that Delver of Secrets all along has been hearing the whispers of Emrakul, and that's what eventually led him to become the insectile aberration to begin with, or whether it's only something that emerged later on after he'd already been the aberration for a while is unclear. You can think of it either way, I think, whether, how long ago he began hearing the whispers of Emrakul. But in the end, he becomes an insect who has enslaved these human wizards, who are his servants and who probably also serve Emrakul, based on the art and everything else. And he, interestingly, has a wizard tribal effect that's pretty neat. Makes wizards better, makes the humans better, sort of representing the experiments that he's done on them. So I just think these cards are just super flavorful. They do an awesome job between the art and the effects of representing this metamorphosis of this one character, if you want to call it, Delver of Secrets, that from way back when. So that does it for this week's MTG Top 10. There'll, of course, be another one next week. Let me know if there's any cards you think are super flavorful in Shadows over Innistrad block that I left off. I probably did. There's just a ton of super flavorful cards. Also, let me know if you think any of the cards I included on here shouldn't have been on here in the comments. If you found the video entertaining and useful, don't forget to click the like button. And if you want to make sure you see an MTG Top 10 every week, don't forget to click the subscribe button below. Thanks for watching.